Ever had your phone die right when you needed to check the weather? Well, medieval farmers never had that problem, mainly because they didn't have phones or electricity or running water. You get the picture. But what they did have was something way cooler. They could read the sky like we read text messages. These farmers were basically walking weather stations, and their forecast accuracy would make some modern meteorologists blush. Take clouds, for instance. While we're busy swiping through weather apps, medieval farmers just had to glance up to know what was coming. Dark, towering clouds meant get inside, now. But it wasn't just about running from rain. They noticed patterns modern science has only recently confirmed. Here's a medieval weather trick that still works today. If you see clouds moving in different directions at different heights like nature's traffic jam, grab an umbrella. Our ancestors figured out that when high and low clouds cross paths, it usually means trouble's brewing. They didn't know about atmospheric pressure or wind shear, but they knew their crops were about to get a good soaking. The sunrise and sunset shows were their primetime weather entertainment. A blood-red sunrise, that was nature's way of saying, hope you like rain. But a red sunset meant tomorrow would be perfect for harvesting. There's actually solid science behind this. Red skies happen when sunlight hits dust particles in the air. In medieval Europe, since weather usually moved from west to east, a red morning meant dust and storms were approaching, while a red evening meant the dust and good weather was heading away. My favorite has to be their moon halo observations. Imagine being a medieval farmer, looking up at night and seeing a perfect ring around the moon. Today, we know these halos form when moonlight hits ice crystals in high-altitude clouds. But back then, it was like nature's early warning system. They noticed that almost every time they saw that glowing ring, rain or snow would follow within 24 hours. That's some seriously reliable forecasting without a single satellite. Speaking of reliability, studies have shown that many of these traditional weather reading methods are accurate about 80 to 85% of the time, which is pretty impressive considering modern local forecasts are right about 90% of the time, and we have computers and radar. It's like they had a supercomputer in their heads, processing countless observations into surprisingly accurate predictions. The medieval farmers had different names for various cloud formations, and some were pretty creative. Those wispy, high-altitude clouds we call cirrus. They called them mare's tails. If you saw these stretched across the sky, you could expect rain within 3 days. And those puffy cotton ball clouds that mean fair weather, they called them weather's eyes because they seemed to watch over the fields on pleasant days. But maybe the most fascinating thing was how they could predict frost just by studying the evening sky. A crystal clear night with absolutely no clouds meant trouble. All the warmth would escape into space, leading to a frosty morning. Some farmers would stay up late watching the stars, knowing that the clearer and more numerous they appeared, the colder it would get by dawn. They'd use this knowledge to decide whether to cover their sensitive crops or not. The really ingenious part was how they combined all these different sky signs to make their predictions. A red sunset plus straight rising smoke meant tomorrow would definitely be good for working in the fields. But if they saw those signs along with a moon halo, they knew the good weather wouldn't last long. Better get the work done early. And you know what's truly remarkable? Many of these methods are still used today by outdoor enthusiasts and farmers who've kept the old knowledge alive. Some modern farmers even say they trust their sky reading skills more than their weather apps, though they probably check both just to be safe. Speaking of safety, medieval farmers didn't just watch the sky, they had a whole army of four-legged weather predictors right in their farmyard. These animals seemed to have a sixth sense about incoming weather changes, and the farmers learned to pay very close attention to their behavior. Take swallows, for example. These little aerial acrobats weren't just pretty to watch. They were the medieval equivalent of a Doppler radar. When they started flying close to the ground, farmers knew rain was coming. The science behind this is pretty neat. Insects swallow food, fly lower when air pressure drops before a storm because their tiny wings work better in dense, humid air. The swallows were just following their lunch, but to farmers, they were better than any weather vane. Something that would have made a medieval farmer chuckle is how their cows were basically living weather stations. When cows suddenly decided to plop down in the field for no apparent reason, It wasn't because they were feeling lazy, they could sense the dropping air pressure before a storm. Some farmers swore that if the cows were lying down while chewing their cud, you had about 6 hours before the rain started. Talk about precise forecasting. Modern research actually backs this up. Studies show that cows become more restless and change their behavior hours before bad weather hits. Dogs were particularly amusing weather predictors. If you saw a medieval farm dog rolling around in the dirt more than usual, it wasn't having a midlife crisis. It was signaling incoming bad weather. The pressure changes before storms apparently made their joints ache just like your grandpa's knee that knows when it's going to rain, so they'd try to relieve the discomfort by rolling around. Some farmers joked that their dogs were more reliable than their own aching joints for predicting rain. Cats were the drama queens of weather forecasting. When they started sneezing or obsessively washing their ears, medieval farmers knew moisture was increasing in the air. One old farmer's tale claims that if a cat washes its face and paws in the morning, good weather will follow, but if it washes its ears, rain is definitely on the way. Scientists now think cats can detect the slight changes in atmospheric pressure through their inner ears, which might explain why they get extra groomy before storms. But the MVP of medieval weather forecasting were horses. These magnificent creatures could sense approaching storms hours before the first cloud appeared. They become restless, snort more frequently, and sometimes refuse to leave their stables. Recent research has shown that horses can detect changes in barometric pressure as small as 0.1 inches of mercury. That's more sensitive than some modern weather instruments. Some farmers said watching their horses was like having an early warning system. If the usually calm plow horse started acting like it had too much coffee, you knew something was brewing. Many of these animal behaviors are now scientifically proven. Studies show that animals can detect infrasound from approaching storms up to 100 miles away. They can also sense changes in barometric pressure that humans can't perceive. One study even found that farm animals react to earthquakes up to 24 hours before they happen, something medieval farmers had long suspected. Bees were particularly reliable weather forecasters. On a medieval farm, if you saw bees staying close to their hive or becoming aggressive, you could bet your last loaf of bread that rain was coming. Modern research has shown that bees can detect changes in humidity, temperature, and pressure that signal approaching storms. They'll even adjust their nectar-gathering trips based on incoming weather. Talk about smart planning. Scientists have discovered that bees won't leave their hive if there's more than a 50% chance of rain. They're basically living probability calculators. Chickens provided some comic relief in this natural weather station. If they started preening excessively or huddling together, medieval farmers knew bad weather was approaching. One old saying went, "If the rooster crows when he goes to bed, he'll certainly rise with a watery head." Translation: if roosters make a racket at sunset, expect rain by morning. Medieval farmers probably got a kick out of watching their strutting roosters accidentally predict their own soggy futures. Speaking of predictions, pigs were surprisingly good at it too. If you saw pigs gathering straw and carrying it to their sty, you could expect seriously bad weather. They'd also become more vocal and agitated before storms. Research has shown that pigs can sense changes in air pressure so subtle that they occur up to 12 hours before humans notice any weather changes. One medieval farmer reportedly said his pig was more accurate than his wife's aching tooth at predicting rain, though we hope he didn't say that in front of his wife. The really clever medieval farmers learned to cross-reference all these animal behaviors. If the cows were lying down, the cats were washing their ears, and the bees weren't flying, that was practically a guarantee of rain. It was like having a whole committee of weather forecasters right there on the farm. Some modern farmers still swear by these animal observations, combining them with modern weather forecasts for the most accurate predictions. While these animal weather forecasters were incredibly reliable, medieval farmers didn't just rely on their farmyard friends. They also paid close attention to which way the wind was blowing, because wind direction could tell them exactly what kind of weather was heading their way. When the wind blew from the east, farmers would groan louder than their rusty barn doors. An east wind was about as welcome as a fox in the chicken coop. It usually meant trouble was coming. Cold, dry air would sweep in, threatening to damage crops and make everyone miserable. There's actually an old saying that goes, "When the wind is in the east, it's neither good for man nor beast." Turns out our ancestors were onto something. Meteorologists now know that in Europe, easterly winds often bring unstable weather patterns and can drop temperatures by up to 15 degrees in just a few hours. But a south wind? That would get farmers moving faster than a merchant offering free ale. Strong southerly winds meant they had about 48 hours before a storm hit. You'd see them scrambling to harvest whatever was ready and tie down anything that might blow away. Some clever farmers even created makeshift wind meters using branches and leaves. If a south wind could lift a certain size leaf, they knew exactly how long they had before the rain started. Research shows they were remarkably accurate. The size of leaf that would lift in a 20-mile-per-hour south wind usually meant rain within 2 days. But it gets interesting when medieval farmers figured out something that took modern science centuries to confirm. They noticed that when warm winds from the south met cold winds from the north, it almost always meant severe weather was coming. Modern meteorologists call this a frontal system, but medieval farmers just called it time to hide in the cellar. They even had a saying, "When south wind meets north blow, wise men go to their houses." The chimney smoke test was their favorite party trick. Every morning they'd check how the smoke rose from their chimneys. If it shot straight up like an arrow, great weather was ahead. But if it hung around at roof level like a lazy cat, they knew rain was coming. The science behind this is fascinating. Smoke rises better in high pressure is good weather, and getting pushed down in low pressure means stormy weather. Some farmers even claimed they could predict how many hours until rain by how low their smoke hung, though this might have been more about impressing the neighbors than actual forecasting. Some particularly observant farmers even noticed that different types of wood smoke behaved differently. Oak smoke was apparently the most reliable weather predictor. Something about its density made it extra sensitive to air pressure changes. Though I suspect some farmers just used this as an excuse to stock up on their favorite firewood. No, dear, I'm not being picky about the wood. I'm being meteorologically accurate. Wind speed was another big deal. Medieval farmers developed a whole system for measuring wind strength without any fancy equipment. A light breeze that could barely move a leaf meant fair weather would stick around. But if the wind was strong enough to make trees dance, as they called it, changes were definitely coming. They even had specific names for different wind strengths. My favorite is a wind strong enough to make a priest curse. Pretty sure that one didn't make it into modern meteorology textbooks. One particularly clever technique involved watching how dust behaved in the wind. If dust got kicked up but settled quickly, humidity was high and rain was likely. But if the dust stayed airborne longer, dry weather would continue. This observation was so reliable that some farmers would deliberately throw a handful of dirt in the air each morning, probably looking quite strange to anyone passing by. Did you know there's actually solid science behind all this wind watching? Studies have shown that in many parts of Europe, about 70% of weather changes can be predicted just by monitoring wind patterns. That's pretty impressive for people who thought the world was flat. Though to be fair, if you're just doing farm work, the world being round doesn't matter much. Their wind predictions got so specific that they could tell you not just if it would rain, but what kind of rain to expect. A steady wind from the southwest bringing warm air, light, soaking rain, gusty winds shifting direction, short, heavy downpours. Some farmers got so good at this they could plan different tasks for different types of rainy days, though I bet they still complained about the weather just as much as we do. Among all these wind-reading techniques, perhaps the most reliable was the combination of wind direction and cloud patterns. When high clouds moved in one direction and surface winds blew another way, medieval farmers knew big changes were coming, a trick that modern meteorologists still use today with their fancy satellite data. Studies show this particular observation is accurate about 85% of the time, which is pretty remarkable for people who had no idea what jet streams were. But winds weren't the only invisible force medieval farmers paid attention to. They also became experts at reading another subtle sign of changing weather, the way the air itself smelled. Well, medieval farmers were basically walking weather stations, and their noses were one of their most trusted tools. Let's dive into how these agricultural experts could smell incoming weather changes with surprising accuracy. First up, that famous rain smell we all know and love. Medieval farmers called it the herald of the clouds because it arrived before the first drops fell. They didn't know the scientific explanation that it's actually bacteria called actinomycetes releasing spores when moisture levels rise, but they knew this smell meant business. get the hay in the barn, cover the grain piles, and maybe grab that medieval equivalent of an umbrella, which was probably just a thick cloak, but hey, it did the job. Medieval farmers were so tuned into these scents that they could actually tell the difference between a short shower and a long storm just by how strong the rain smell was. A light, fresh scent meant a passing shower, while a heavy, intense, earthy smell meant it was time to batten down the hatches for a proper downpour. One old farming journal from the 1300s even mentioned that when the earth breathes deeply, the sky will weep heavily. Pretty poetic for a bunch of practical farmers, right? The impressive part was how they used flowers as natural barometers. When flowers suddenly started smelling extra sweet and strong, farmers knew they were in for some dry weather. This wasn't just some random guess. Flowers actually release more fragrance when the air pressure is high and stable, which typically means clear skies ahead. Medieval farmers would walk through their gardens in the morning, taking deep whiffs of their roses and lavender. If the scent was powerful enough to make their eyes water, they knew it was safe to start the big outdoor jobs. But it wasn't all pleasant aromas. Medieval farmers also paid attention to the not-so-nice smells. A damp, musty smell at night was like a big flashing warning sign saying, "Rain tomorrow." This smell usually showed up when warm, moist air was moving in, creating perfect conditions for tomorrow's rainfall. One particularly grumpy farmer's note from the 1400s complained that when the night air smells like wet sheep's wool, only fools plan to dry their grain. They even noticed how different types of rain had different smells. A warm spring rain smelled different from a cold autumn downpour. Summer storm smell was distinct from a gentle morning drizzle. It's like they had a whole library of weather scents stored in their memory. Some farmers got so good at it that their neighbors would actually come over just to ask, "What's the weather smell saying today?" Here's a fact. Medieval farmers noticed that their manure piles smelled stronger right before it rained. While they probably weren't thrilled about this particular weather indicator, it was actually quite reliable. The lower air pressure before rain caused gases to rise more readily from the decomposing material. So next time someone wrinkles their nose at a farm smell, you can enlighten them about its historical weather predicting importance, though maybe save that conversation for after dinner. And it's really clever how they combine these smell observations with other signs. If they caught that pre-rain smell and noticed their cows getting restless, something we learned about in the previous section, they knew they were definitely in for some wet weather. It was like having a medieval version of multiple weather apps, all giving the same forecast. Speaking of combinations, they also paid attention to how the air smelled when the wind changed direction. An east wind brought its own distinct scent, usually sharp and clean. A south wind had a different character altogether, often carrying the smell of approaching storms. They could literally smell which way the weather was coming from. Medieval farmers even taught their children these weather-smelling skills from an early age. Can you imagine those lessons? "Come here, young Thomas, and smell this patch of dirt. That's what tomorrow's rain feels like." It might sound funny to us now, but these skills were crucial for survival back then. Many of their smell-based predictions were surprisingly accurate. Modern studies have shown that human noses can detect upcoming rain with about 75% accuracy, so these medieval farmers were onto something real. They might not have had fancy weather radar, but they had something just as valuable: generations of experience reading nature's aromatic signals. And speaking of nature's signals, the medieval farmers didn't just stop at smelling the air. They were keen observers of every natural sign around them, especially when it came to how trees and plants behaved before weather changes. It's just like us checking our phones every morning for the weather forecast, and medieval farmers had their own ritual. Instead of swiping screens, they strolled through their gardens and woods, reading nature's own weather app written in leaves and branches. Take pine cones, for example. These little wooden weather stations were more reliable than some modern forecasts, and definitely more reliable than Uncle Bob's knee when it comes to predicting rain. Medieval farmers noticed something fascinating. Pine cones would snap shut tighter than a miser's purse when rain was approaching. The science behind it is pretty cool. Pine cones close up to protect their seeds when humidity rises. But our medieval friends didn't need to know about humidity sensors or plant biology. They just knew that closed cones meant grab your cloak, it's going to rain. Speaking of nature's peculiar behaviors, let's talk about the drama queen of the plant world, the poplar tree. When a storm was brewing, poplar leaves would flip upside down, showing their pale undersides like a crowd of people throwing their hands up in panic. This wasn't just some random tree tantrum. The leaves were actually responding to rising humidity levels before a storm. One old farming record from 1432 noted, "When the poplar shows its silver, the wise farmer shows his sense and brings in the hay." Not exactly Shakespeare, but it got the point across. Fruit trees were the long-term weather prophets of the medieval world. If apple and pear trees suddenly started ripening their fruit weeks ahead of schedule, farmers knew winter was coming early, and it wasn't going to be gentle. It's like the trees were saying, "Quick, take these apples. Trust me, you're going to need them sooner than you think." Modern science has actually backed this up. Plants can sense environmental changes weeks before humans notice anything different. Recent studies have shown that trees can detect temperature changes as small as 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit and adjust their growth patterns accordingly. Farmers also kept a close eye on their oak trees, which had a reputation for being the wise elders of the forest. There's an old saying, "If the oak leaves out before the ash, 'twill be a summer of wet and splash. If the ash leaves out before the oak, 'twill be a summer of fire and smoke." Surprisingly, this bit of medieval weather wisdom holds up pretty well even today. Oak trees are more sensitive to temperature, while ash trees respond more to light levels, making them natural indicators of upcoming seasonal patterns. In fact, modern research shows that oak trees are right about incoming weather patterns roughly 80% of the time. But it wasn't just the big trees that got all the attention. Small plants had their own weather-predicting talents. Take the scarlet pimpernel, nicknamed the poor man's weatherglass. This tiny flower would close its petals tight when rain was coming, usually about 2 to 3 hours before the first drops fell. Medieval farmers joked that it was more reliable than the local weather prophet, who usually just looked at the same flowers and pretended to have special powers. They had a saying, "When the pimpernel's petals close their eyes, rain will make the farmer wise." Dandelions played their part too, though they were probably the laziest weather predictors. When rain was approaching, they would close up their seed heads, refusing to release their fluffy seeds into soon-to-be-wet air. Smart move for seed dispersal, and helpful for farmers who needed to know whether to start their outdoor work. As one farmer supposedly quipped, "If the dandelion's sleeping in, perhaps we should too." Onions and cabbages would grow extra leaves in years when a harsh winter was coming. Medieval farmers noticed this and would adjust their winter food storage accordingly. It's like the vegetables were trying to bundle up for winter. Modern scientists have confirmed that many plants can indeed sense and prepare for long-term weather changes, though they probably wouldn't recommend using your vegetable garden as a primary weather service. Studies suggest that certain vegetables can detect seasonal changes up to 6 weeks before they occur. Mushrooms were particularly chatty about upcoming weather too. A sudden explosion of mushrooms popping up meant wet weather was on its way. This makes perfect sense since fungi thrive in moist conditions and often fruit right before rain. Some medieval farmers called mushroom patches witches' weather marks, though that probably had more to do with general medieval suspicion of mushrooms than any actual witchcraft. One old farmer's diary mentioned that mushrooms sprouting like soldiers' tents meant 3 days of rain was coming. And it's really clever how medieval farmers would combine all these plant signals together. If the pine cones were closed, the poplars were flipping out, and the scarlet pimpernel had shut up shop, you could bet your last medieval penny it was going to rain. It was like having multiple weather forecasters all agreeing at once. Modern meteorologists actually use a similar principle. They look at multiple indicators before making a forecast, just like our medieval ancestors did with their plants. But perhaps the most interesting thing about all this plant-based weather forecasting was how accurate it could be. Studies of traditional weather wisdom have shown that many of these plant-based predictions are correct about 85% of the time, which, let's be honest, is better than some weather apps we could mention. These medieval farmers might not have had satellites or computer models, but they had something just as valuable: generations of careful observation and a deep connection to the natural world around them. But while trees and flowers were busy predicting the weather with their silent signals, down by the ponds and streams, frogs and fish had mastered their own weather forecasting arts. Their peculiar behaviors before storms would prove just as reliable as any swaying tree or closing flower. The frogs, usually content with their regular croaking volume, were suddenly putting on a performance that would rival a medieval church choir. No, they weren't auditioning for Medieval's Got Talent. They were actually announcing an incoming storm. These amphibian weather forecasters were so reliable that some villages reportedly used them instead of church bells to warn of approaching rain. The science behind frog forecasting is pretty fascinating. Studies show that frogs can detect changes in barometric pressure through their super-sensitive skin. When air pressure drops before a storm, frogs get incredibly chatty, probably because they know these conditions are perfect for breeding. Recent research has found that some frog species can detect pressure changes as small as 0.1 millibars, which puts them on par with modern weather instruments. Medieval farmers would often say, "When the frogs sing their evening song, tomorrow's weather won't go wrong." If the croaking reached fever pitch during the afternoon, rain was usually just hours away. One particularly grumpy farmer's diary from 1467 complained about those blessed frogs keeping the whole village awake the night before a massive storm, though you'd think after years of farming, he'd be grateful for the heads up. But frogs weren't the only aquatic weather prophets. Fish had their own way of signaling incoming weather changes. When fish suddenly started jumping like they were trying to escape the water altogether, medieval farmers knew a storm was brewing. This wasn't just random fish gymnastics, the dropping air pressure before a storm affects their swim bladders, making them uncomfortable enough to leap above the surface. In fact, fishing communities developed entire weather prediction systems based on fish behavior. If the fish were feeding close to the surface, it meant fair weather would stick around. But if they dove deep and seemed to disappear, time to batten down the hatches. Modern studies have confirmed this behavior, showing that fish can detect pressure changes of just 2 millibars. That's sensitive enough to predict a storm nearly 48 hours in advance. Then there were the crickets, nature's tiny thermometers. Medieval farmers discovered you could actually calculate the temperature by counting cricket chirps. The warmer it got, the faster they chirped. Modern science has turned this into a real formula. Count the chirps in 15 seconds, add 37, and you'll get the temperature in Fahrenheit. Who needs a thermometer when you've got a garden full of cricket calculators? Spiders turned out to be surprisingly good meteorologists, too. When spiders strengthened their webs and made them shorter, medieval farmers knew fair weather was ahead. But if the spiders started building longer support threads or taking their webs down entirely, storm incoming. One medieval text noted, "The spider works badly before rain, but skillfully in fair weather." Modern archaeologists have found that spiders can indeed sense atmospheric pressure changes through specialized hairs on their legs. Even earthworms got in on the weather forecasting game. When worms suddenly appeared all over the ground's surface, rain was imminent. Medieval farmers called this the worm exodus, and it was one of their most trusted signs of incoming rain. Today, we know that worms surface before rain to avoid drowning in their tunnels. They're basically playing a medieval version of "the ground is lava." Medieval farmers noticed that ants would build up the walls around their ant hills before rain. The higher the walls, the longer the rain would last. They weren't just being overly cautious. Ants can detect approaching rain through changes in humidity and air pressure. Recent research shows that ants can sense rainfall up to 24 hours in advance with shocking accuracy. They get it right about 85% of the time. The most impressive insect weather predictors were probably dragonflies. When they flew high in the air, medieval farmers could count on good weather. But when dragonflies suddenly started flying close to the ground, rain was coming, and soon. This behavior is linked to air pressure changes. When pressure drops before a storm, insects that dragonflies hunt fly lower, and the dragonflies follow their food. Speaking of flight patterns, medieval farmers also kept a close eye on where flies landed in their homes. If flies started clustering on walls or seemed more aggressive than usual, rain was on the way. One old farming journal grumbled about flies being more bothersome than the tax collector before storms. And if you knew anything about medieval tax collectors, that was saying something. As the frosty winds of winter approached, these small creatures would show different signs that help predict the changing seasons. In fact, medieval farmers found that frost patterns told their own unique story about what kind of winter was coming. Medieval farmers didn't just sit around waiting for winter to happen. They were like detective meteorologists, reading every single hint nature dropped about the upcoming cold season. Frost wasn't just a white covering on the ground. It was a complex language that told stories about temperature, moisture, and the harsh months ahead. Early frost was the ultimate winter warning sign. When the first frost arrived earlier than usual, medieval farmers knew they were in for a long, brutal winter. This wasn't just superstition, it was a survival strategy. An early frost meant crops needed to be harvested faster, livestock needed extra protection, and firewood needed to be stockpiled immediately. One farming record from 1389 noted that when the first frost kisses the ground before the harvest moon, winter shall be a harsh mistress indeed. The type of frost mattered just as much as its timing. Hoarfrost, those delicate crystal-like ice formations, was particularly fascinating. When hoarfrost appeared without clouds, medieval farmers knew a dry, cold spell was coming. These intricate ice crystals formed on clear, cold nights when moisture in the air froze directly onto surfaces. Some farmers had such a keen eye that they could predict the duration of the cold spell just by looking at the hoarfrost's density and pattern. Medieval meteorological records show that farmers tracked frost patterns with almost scientific precision. They noticed that certain frost formations predicted specific weather conditions. A light, delicate frost might indicate a brief cold snap, while a thick, heavy frost suggested prolonged cold temperatures. One particularly detailed farming diary from the 14th century included over 50 different descriptions of frost types and their potential meanings. Dew played its own fascinating role in winter weather prediction. Heavy morning dew might seem counterintuitive, but medieval farmers knew it meant fair weather was ahead. When the ground cooled evenly overnight and moisture condensed smoothly, it signaled stable atmospheric conditions. This wasn't just a random observation, it was a sophisticated understanding of how temperature, humidity, and air pressure interact. Interestingly, the location of frost mattered too. Frost that appeared first on low-lying areas indicated different weather patterns compared to frost that started on higher ground. Farmers would walk their fields at dawn, carefully observing these subtle differences. Some regions even had specific local sayings about frost patterns. One old Welsh farming proverb suggested that frost on the north side of the stone wall speaks of a different winter than frost on the south. The color and texture of frost provided additional insights. A bluish-white frost suggested different atmospheric conditions compared to a more yellowish or grayish frost. Medieval farmers didn't have color charts or scientific instruments, but generations of observation had taught them to read these subtle variations like a book. Modern meteorologists would be impressed by the accuracy of these traditional observations. Temperature wasn't the only thing frost could predict. Medieval farmers discovered that frost patterns could give hints about upcoming agricultural seasons. A certain type of frost might suggest an early spring or a late harvest. Some farming communities even had specialized frost readers, respected elders who could interpret these icy messages with remarkable accuracy. Tracking ice formations on water sources was another crucial strategy. The thickness, clarity, and formation of ice on ponds and streams told stories about temperature trends. Clear, thick ice suggested a consistently cold period, while cloudy or uneven ice might indicate fluctuating temperatures. Farmers used these observations to plan everything from livestock management to firewood collection. Medieval farmers didn't just passively observe these frost patterns, they actively used them for survival. If early frost suggested a long winter, they would adjust their entire agricultural strategy. This might mean harvesting crops earlier, protecting livestock more aggressively, or storing extra food. Their survival literally depended on reading these subtle natural signals correctly. Some regions developed incredibly complex frost prediction systems. In parts of northern Europe, farmers would create detailed journals tracking frost patterns, comparing them across years, and developing increasingly sophisticated prediction methods. These were essentially the first climate change records, decades before scientific meteorology became a formal discipline. One fascinating aspect of medieval frost reading was its connection to lunar cycles. Farmers noticed that frost behaved differently depending on the moon's phase. A full moon on a clear winter night often meant more intense, predictable frost patterns. Some communities even had specific rituals and practices tied to observing frost during different lunar phases. As the night approaches, frost and ice whisper their own winter stories, but the moon has been busy telling even more complex tales about the seasons ahead. Its shifting phases hold secrets that, to the trained eye, reveal weather patterns months in advance. Medieval farmers didn't just glance at the moon, they studied it like a living almanac. decoding its luminous clues to prepare for what nature had in store. Medieval farmers weren't just ground-level weather watchers, they had their eyes turned skyward, particularly to the moon. This celestial body wasn't just a pretty nightlight, it was a complex weather predictor that could tell stories about upcoming seasons, storms, and agricultural challenges. A bright, extra-luminous full moon during winter was more than just a beautiful sight. Medieval farmers knew it meant something serious. Clear skies and dropping temperatures were coming. When the moon shone with an almost supernatural intensity on a winter night, farmers would prepare for a hard frost by morning. They'd rush to protect vulnerable crops, move livestock to sheltered areas, and ensure their firewood was well stocked. The moon's phases became a sophisticated weather prediction system. A new moon appearing in a completely cloudless sky wasn't just an astronomical event, it was a sign of an upcoming dry spell. Farmers would interpret this as a signal to prepare for potentially weeks of dry weather. Some agricultural communities even had specific rituals around observing these lunar transitions, tracking them with a precision that would impress modern meteorologists. Not all moon appearances were created equal. A pale, dim moon wasn't just a sign of cloud cover, it was a direct warning of incoming moisture. Medieval farmers understood that a hazy lunar appearance meant rain was likely within the next few days. This wasn't random guesswork. Generations of observation had turned this into a refined predictive skill. Some farming journals from the 14th and 15th centuries contained incredibly detailed logs of moon appearances and corresponding weather patterns. Interestingly, different cultures had their own unique lunar weather prediction methods. In Northern European farming communities, farmers would track the moon's appearance during different seasons with remarkable detail. A winter moon that appeared slightly tilted might indicate a more severe cold spell, while a summer moon with a particular glow could suggest an upcoming heat wave. Research suggests that lunar observations were surprisingly accurate. Modern meteorological studies have found that lunar cycles can indeed influence weather patterns, though not exactly in the way medieval farmers believed. The moon's gravitational pull affects ocean tides, atmospheric pressure, and wind patterns, subtle influences that can indeed impact local weather conditions. Some medieval farming communities developed complex lunar calendars that went far beyond simple weather prediction. These calendars tracked not just moon phases, but their appearance, color, and surrounding atmospheric conditions. A farmer's lunar calendar was like an ancient version of a weather app, providing insights into potential agricultural challenges months in advance. The connection between the moon and weather wasn't just about prediction, it was about survival. In an era without modern agricultural technology, understanding potential weather patterns could mean the difference between a successful harvest and total crop failure. A farmer who could read the moon's signals had a significant advantage over those who couldn't. Lunar observations were particularly crucial during planting and harvesting seasons. Farmers would time their most critical agricultural activities based on moon phases, believing that certain lunar conditions provided optimal conditions for crop growth. While some of these beliefs might seem superstitious today, many were rooted in generations of careful observation and practical experience. Different moon phases were associated with different agricultural activities. A waxing moon might be considered ideal for planting crops that grew above ground, while a waning moon was thought better for root crops. These weren't just random beliefs. They represented a sophisticated understanding of seasonal cycles and agricultural timing. Some medieval texts even suggested that the moon's appearance could predict longer-term weather trends. A particularly bright or dim moon during a specific season might indicate whether the upcoming months would be wet or dry, cold or mild. Farmers would adjust their entire agricultural strategy based on these lunar observations. The most interesting aspect of medieval lunar weather prediction was its blend of practical observation and what we might today call folkloric wisdom. These farmers weren't just making wild guesses, they were collecting generational data, comparing observations, and developing increasingly sophisticated prediction methods. While the moon told its complex weather stories, medieval farmers knew that the most immediate weather signals often came from the church bells ringing across the villages, a sound that carried more than just religious significance, but also warnings of impending disaster and changing weather. Long before smartphones and weather apps, medieval farmers had developed an extraordinary skill that might sound almost magical today, predicting weather through sound. Church bells weren't just instruments of religious call, but sophisticated meteorological tools that carried whispers of atmospheric changes across entire villages. When a church bell sound traveled unusually far, medieval farmers knew something significant was brewing in the sky. This wasn't just superstition, it was a precise understanding of how atmospheric conditions affect sound transmission. Changes in air pressure and humidity could dramatically alter how sound waves moved through the atmosphere. A bell that could be heard miles beyond its typical range was a clear warning that a storm was approaching. The science behind this phenomenon is fascinating. Sound travels differently through various atmospheric conditions. When air pressure drops and humidity increases, typical conditions before a storm, sound waves can travel much farther and with greater clarity. Medieval farmers might not have understood the complex physics, but they knew exactly what those extra loud bells meant. Batten down the hatches, a storm is coming. In different regions, this sound-based meteorology took on unique characteristics. Alpine villages developed particularly sophisticated systems where church bell sounds were treated almost like a complex language. The pitch, duration, and reach of the bell sound could communicate nuanced information about upcoming weather patterns that went far beyond simple storm warnings. But church bells weren't the only sound-based weather predictor. Medieval listeners discovered that distant sounds becoming mysteriously clearer was another reliable weather indicator. Farmers could suddenly hear a dog barking from miles away or the distant river's current sounding unusually loud. These were not random occurrences, but precise meteorological signals. Moisture plays a crucial role in sound transmission. Water particles in the air can actually help sound waves travel more efficiently, carrying them farther than they would normally go. Medieval farmers realized that when sounds seemed unnaturally crisp and clear, it often meant rain was imminent. They developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between normal sound and rain sounds. The opposite was equally true. When sounds become muted or oddly dampened, it signaled something completely different. Muffled, dull sounds typically indicated high-pressure systems and upcoming dry weather. A village that suddenly seemed wrapped in acoustic cotton was a sure sign of stable, dry conditions ahead. Local topography added another layer of complexity to these sound-based predictions. Villages nestled in valleys or near mountains would experience sound transmission differently compared to open plains. Experienced farmers knew exactly how sound should behave in their specific landscape, making their predictions remarkably accurate. Interestingly, different types of sounds carried different meteorological messages. Church bells had their own language. The way they rang, how far they carried, their tone and resonance all told different stories about upcoming weather. A bell that seemed to sing differently might indicate approaching humidity or pressure changes. Some communities took this sound-based meteorology so seriously that they would assign specific listeners, almost like ancient weather forecasters, whose sole job was to monitor atmospheric sound conditions. These weren't just random villagers, but trained observers who understood the subtle nuances of how sound travels through different weather conditions. Modern acoustic meteorology has actually confirmed many of these traditional observations. While medieval farmers didn't understand complex physics, they had developed an empirical understanding of sound-weather relationships that modern scientists find remarkably sophisticated. Their observations weren't just folklore, they were sophisticated, experience-based scientific measurements. As the sounds of bells and distant echoes faded, medieval farmers recognized that their understanding of weather went far beyond sound. It was a complex symphony of observations that touched every aspect of the natural world around them.